got James Schiano, we've got Eric Dadmun, and we have Anthony Tucker. They are all here talking about draft strategy, player ADP debates. I can't say words. Debates. Oh my God, guys, I'm losing it. So why not remove me? That's exactly what I'm going to do. Take it away.
We'll take it from here, Nick. Thanks everyone for sticking around with us. As Nick mentioned, this is ADP player debates. We've got 4 pairs of players around the same ADP, and each of us are going to be talking about who we like and why. So before we dive into our first ADP debate, let's go ahead and get the panel introduced. So let's start with James. James, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at PitcherList and a little bit more about the work and some about yourself too. Why not?
Yeah, why not? What's up, everybody? My name is James. I've been writing at PitcherList since just before the pandemic in 2020. I write some core fantasy stuff. I write some general baseball stuff. Last couple of years, I wrote a couple of gambling articles. I wrote the starting pitcher schedule previews last season. And I also have a podcast I do with a fellow PitchCon contributor, Draftneck Mark, called Metsed Up, that comes out once a week in the offseason and after every series during the season. And I'm pretty excited that we can usher in this era of the white-walled player debates here, as all of us here, me, Eric, and Anthony, are all sitting in rooms with pure white walls to keep everyone's eyes focused on the prize.
Yes, we cannot have anybody distracted from this very, very important hour. Only content all the time. Anthony, let's hear from you. How's it going?
Going well. Really excited to be here and to chat with you and James here on some player debates. Last year was my first year on the PitcherList staff. During the season, I had the weekly 2-start pitcher article, which was a really fun way to kind of start to get into fantasy baseball content and really diving back in again this year, and excited to get into some of these player debates.
Excellent. And I am Eric Dadmun. I am on the relievers team. So you found me last year on those bullpen depth charts that came out every week. And I am also, well, it's every day, but I had one day of the week. I'm also going to be doing that next year. Just came out with my relieving pitcher, my reliever sleepers and busts as well. So if you want to get the jump on some early saves or know who to avoid in terms of saves, go ahead and look at those articles. But today it's not about just saves. We are going to be debating starters. We're going to be debating relievers, hitters from all over the draft. But I want to start kind of towards the top of the draft. Let's get our first debate started. Let me set the picture for you. We're around ADP 35 to 40. And you've got 2 really good pitchers staring at you. The first one would allow you to set your saves and get a great foundation of ratios. It's Josh Hader. And the other one is a guy who underperformed a little bit last year, but who's still seen as a guy who can be a low-end number one starter. It's Aaron Nola, both of whom going in that 35 to 40 range. So who you got? Early in the draft, Josh Hader, Aaron Nola. Let's start with James again.
Eric, I can't believe you led this in saying it's not all about saves, because if anyone out there has drafted early in any 5x5 league so far this year, especially draft champions NFBC, it is literally all about saves. And with this debate, I'm taking Josh Hader running away.
Yeah, we've not seen closers go this high in a while. Yeah, Anthony, are you in the same boat?
I am. I'm on Aaron Nola's side for this one. I do think there's certainly some nuance to this debate, and we kind of brought it up already. It really depends on like your league type. If it's a league where there isn't in-season pickups and fab and things like that, such as like the draft champions, maybe that's a part of why Hader has been pushed up so early. And I think I can kind of see the logic on why you might take Hader in that type of situation with so many, not clear closer situations. But I'm pretty firmly on the Nola side for this one.
Sounds like a great debate.
Interesting. Yeah. So I happen to be on the Nola side as well. So James, you're a little outnumbered for now, as one of us always will be, unless we're three on the same side. So James, I'll give you the first word then. Elaborate. Why are you picking Josh Hader here?
All right. The biggest reason that I'm picking Josh Hader here, apart from the fact that he's still probably the best relief pitcher in baseball, despite the fact his team is very good, he's always going to have plus defense behind him, and he's been extremely secure in the closer role, despite the fact that the Brewers have had a monstrous bullpen for years running now. It's just the fact that we don't see that many strong and steady, consistent closers in baseball as we once did. What are they right now? Like 8, 9, maybe guys who you can look at right now and say this guy is guaranteed the bona fide closer, and it would take something cataclysmic to knock him out of that role. And just that being said, like we've seen the number of players who save 30 games in any given season shrink dramatically over the last decade of baseball. From 2011 to 2015, 91 different players saved, not different players. There were 91 instances of a player saving at least 30 games. That number is only 58 from 2016 to 2021. And that's still both 5 seasons, even given the COVID shortened year in there. And that number has shrunk a lot. You saw 19, 15, 19, 17, 21 guys do it, 2011, 2015. And then since then, 16, 11, 11, 11, and just 9 players saved 30 games last season. And 7 of those 9 guys were the premium guys that you were paying for at the top of your drafts, your Hader, your Hendricks, your Iglesias, your Diaz. Only 2 of them really came out of nowhere, and they were Melanton and McGee, depending on where you fell in the manual Class A heading into last season. But just seeing the scarcity of the save resource and also just the uncertainty around Nola, as well as a couple of other pitchers that you're going to get around this, I see it as like basically a 2-3 bend or the middle of the 3rd round in your 12-teamers between Nola, Giolito, depending how you feel about Julio Urias. I just think that getting your saves locked up and secure in a rotisserie league is paramount to winning them.
So are you planning your draft around taking a guy like Hader or Hendricks? Because we're seeing them go as high as in the middle of the 2nd round. You kind of have to jump ADP if you want to build a strategy around them.
No, yeah, for sure. And these are guys that have been going in the 5th and 6th and even the 4th rounds as recently as last year. But each Hader and Hendricks right now have a min pick on NFBC in the low 20s. Hader at 21 and Hendricks at 22. So I am planning my picks. I've set my my draft preference mostly at the beginning of the 1st round, so I can even get a bat that I feel comfortable with. And then even before the turn, take one of these guys and then complete the rest of my draft later. Get that, secure that 30 to 40 saves, and then move on after that.
Yeah, there's definitely a tier 1 in closers that I think I can't remember how long it's been since we've had closers go in the top 30. I know it's happened before. There was like back in like 03, 04, Eric Gagne was like a top 10 pick, but it's been a while since we've seen that. But let's turn it over to Anthony. Defend yourself. So James has just laid out this argument for why we need to secure saves early. Why are you comfortable waiting a little bit later here?
Yeah, for me, I think it's just kind of my comfort in kind of, finding saves throughout the year on the wire. I do want to get at least one like locked in closer. I just don't want to be the team that kind of sets the market on the closer. So I think I'd be definitely more comfortable waiting to see in my draft where, a Hader or a Liam Hendricks fall, and then, go out and get somebody like Edwin Diaz or Raisel Iglesias. I think what makes this debate in particular interesting is that you're really not getting a big discount on Aaron Nola a year after he posts a 4.5 ERA. Obviously, it was a frustrating year in terms of ERA, for him. But even with that, like everything went wrong, and he was still a true asset in WHIP and had really elite strikeouts for your team. So I think you see kind of the worst case scenario for Nola, and it's still over. I think he had like 220 something strikeouts last year. So in the worst case, you're still getting one of those guys who's going to provide you with elite strikeouts and volume. He's been a workhorse and healthy throughout his career. He's one of those pitchers that has, plus stuff and location. And the combination of those two things makes me comfortable that he can get a bit closer back to that ace level, back end SP1 production that we've seen him capable of in the past. And I think it's been a pretty kind of well-known narrative about Nola kind of coming into this draft season. But he did have that outsized home runs per 9 of like over 1.4 last year. 1.3, which was significantly above his career average. So I think if he can just make a few adjustments to get the pure volume of fly balls down, get a few more ground balls, and I think that alone helps him normalize back to kind of his career ratios, and will really go a long way. In addition to that, another kind of well-known thing about Nola last year was he really had difficulty stranding runners. You know, I think if that comes back a little bit, you're looking at a guy who's going to be a really dependable, you know, SP1, or if you went, you know, pitcher early, maybe you've got like the, you know, best SP2 you can find on your team.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to clarify and to expand on a couple of points here, you mentioned the problem stranding runners. Aaron Nola last among qualified starters in left on base percentage, 66.8%, dead last among qualified starters. Yeah, the fly ball rate went up. And also the BABIP was a little higher than his career rate, but yeah, really it was the left on base percentage, which the Phillies bullpen was just not that great last year.
Does left on base percentage include your inherited runners that you give to relievers that score? Is that a part of that equation? Do you guys know?
Not off the top of my head, but I believe they
feel
count
like
against you, correct?
Yeah, I feel like I've heard it definitely counts against you, but I feel like I've heard that does count against your left on base percentage. And that's something that's probably only going to improve for Nola marginally compared to last year. I know they got Corey Knebel, but that Phillies bullpen as a whole is still definitely suspect. And he still pitches in one of the worst parks in the National League, in Citizens Bank, a place that has a park factor that's probably in like the worst 10 or probably even 8 in all of baseball. But then, like, I do agree with your point, Anthony, that you're getting something very similar when you look at that next year of closers between Emmanuel Clase, Raciel Iglesias, Edwin Diaz, even Ryan Presley, someone who I'm also particularly very high on. And those guys all have like skills that are on par with the top guys. They all have similar levels of job security. As much as a Mets fan would like to not believe that Edwin Diaz has one of the most secure closer jobs in baseball, all those teams are definitely going to be at least around 500, including the Angels and the Guardians. Kind of feels weird saying the Guardians, but that's who they are. So any of those guys could give you the saves and then probably some similar types of ratios and strikeout numbers as the big two. But then you look at the comparison at the starting pitchers who are going around that ADP, and you look at someone like Lance Lynn, Kevin Gausman, Max Fried, Logan Webb, if you're lucky, Jose Barrios, and you kind of have to, I don't know, when I look at those guys compared to Nola, I'm not seeing as great or vast of a difference to where I would be okay with taking a closer or rung down. Like, I know Nola's definitely going to strike more guys out than those people, and Nola is probably going to face a better schedule on all of those guys except for Max Fried. But there's still, and I guess Lance Lynn, but there's still just, even like you could push Dylan Cease up to this range, possibly. Guys been talked about a lot at PitchCon. So I just don't see as much of the upside in drafting Nola with one of these closers who's a hair below, rather than taking the Hader or the Hendricks and then attacking this level of starting pitching.
Yeah, just one more point against Nola, actually. The Phillies' defense is also actually last in defensive runs saved. That left side of the infield with Gregorius and Bohm really had a lot of problems. You hope Bohm's going to make some strides, and that would help Nola a little bit. But the defense definitely didn't help Nola much either. I still, despite all of this, I'm still on the Nola side because, as a relievers guy, I'm comfortable waiting in the draft to get my relievers. And I think your decision here about whether you, the impersonal you, the listener, want to take Nola or Hader here, it really depends on how comfortable you are chasing saves. Are you going to be reading the bullpen depth charts every day? Are you going to be paying attention to other bullpen experts around the league? Greg Jewett, who we've got coming in, George Montanez, reliever recon, the roster resource. Are you going to be looking at all of those resources every week? Or do you just want to set it and forget it on your closer and get value later in the draft? That's kind of the decision that's to be made here.
And of course, it all matters for team context and league context as well. In a points league, this is not much of a debate. I think basically all of us will be taking Aaron Nola. You probably see a guy like Hader's ADP fall down at least a round, if not two, probably pretty easily, especially also in leagues where FAB is something that's more accessible. If you just have a strict waiver league or a strict add drop league, it's much easier to like find and identify your closers as the season moves on. If you're in a FAB league, it gets a little more difficult because everybody is probably going to have a couple of days to catch up to the information and wait for Sunday to see who's going to be closing games for the Rangers or the Pirates or the Orioles. But in a lot of, I am someone who I would like this year, especially the way baseball is moving, to be able to set and forget my saves with one of the few guys who's has a shot at actually 40 of them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We kind of have the same logic. We're just on like, different sides of the coin. Like, I definitely I want one closer on my team who has a defined role, and I'm not all that picky on who it is. But when I'm looking for like that first pitcher on my team, I think I'd rather have like a Nola than a Lance Lynn, just out of personal preference. So I think I just, I want to be more choosy with who that first pitcher is, or the first starting pitcher is. So I think that's a lot, around what side you'll be on, is what are you more comfortable, or what are you more, picky about, your top reliever or that top starter. You definitely need at least one of those early on.
Yeah, definitely. It also becomes comfortability on what position that you feel like you kind of have an edge on your league mates, or where your gut is more telling you where to go. I usually in fantasy, I love analyzing starting pitching. So I'm comfortable with missing out on the early batch of starters and being able to like double tap or triple tap the guys in the mid rounds. A draft I did last week, a draft champions NFBC, I took Hader around the 2-3 turn. And then later on, I double tapped like a Barrios and a McClanahan. And I figured between those guys, I'd at least be giving myself 310, 315 quality innings of plus strikeouts and plus ERA. The whip is going to struggle a little bit, but I think I can probably attack that later on. And when you get a guy like Hader and a guy like Hendricks, and even that second tier of closers, the Presley, the Clase, the Diaz, I don't think a lot of people realize how much their ERAs and whips actually do affect your ratios by the end of the year. Right now, per ATC projections and the auction calculator on Fangraphs, which is a great tool if anybody out there has never used it. It's fantastic to like be able to identify tiers in your draft rooms. Josh Hader is the 5th most valuable pitcher, all pitchers, in terms of ERA, and 10th most valuable in whip. And Clase and Hendricks are not very far behind, with Presley being a little bit behind those guys. So getting these elite relievers, while you are giving up something in terms of innings and the Ks that we might think of, you are getting relatively more Ks than you would over the other relievers you're drafting later just for save to the guys in your waiver wire than you would expect. And I think that's another thing that kind of nudges them up a tiny bit for me.
Makes sense. Yeah, you talked about the strategy of double tapping. I mean, I sometimes am getting in my mocks, I'm sometimes getting priced out of even that next group of 4 after Hader Hendricks, the Diaz, Clase, and the other 2 whose names I'm forgetting. But I find myself sliding down to like pick 100 and then double tapping Romano and Gallegos, and feeling pretty happy with that, honestly. I'm pretty happy waiting and getting Romano and Gallegos as 2 of the later RP1s, and honestly a really good RP2 in Gallegos. I'm pretty comfortable with that. So it's interesting that we mirror each other's strategies in terms of getting multiples of guys that we like at the opposite position.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great strategy. Both those guys, as things currently stand, we always worry about the Kenley Jansen bomb in Toronto, but as things currently stand, those guys will both be plus closers this entire year with pretty ample job security. Time to move on?
Yeah, I think so, unless Anthony has a final word.
All good here.
All right. Next player debate. I think we're going to talk about 2 mid-round hitters who offer very different categorical, advantages to you, and 2 guys who I think have a little bit more upside than some other hitters you're going to see on the board right now. And those 2 guys are Wander Franco and Pete Alonso. So I'm going to pass it off to Eric. Who would you rather have from this group, Wander Franco or Pete Alonso?
I am slightly onto the Pete Alonso side, mainly because of the positional depth or lack thereof in first, and the really wide depth, the big depth in shortstop that we have this year.
Anthony?
Yeah, I would say out of our 4-player debates, this was probably the one that I had the strongest thoughts on, and that was I'm pretty strongly on the Pete Alonso side, and that's like what Eric mentioned, the depth of shortstop, quality shortstops compared to first base. First base, you have a few really strong guys, and then others who are certainly starter quality, but might not have, upside like some of the later shortstops do. And then the other point is that I think what we're expecting out of Wander in year 2, like where we're drafting him, we're expecting a pretty big jump in production, including steals. And then the kind of third and final point is just seeing the improvements Pete Alonso made last year, even if you don't see it in that stat line, just, the looking at that reduced strikeout rate is pretty great to see if you're thinking about drafting him.
This is probably out of the 4 debates that we had, that was the closest mix on. It's like really split down the middle. And just for the sake of argument here, I guess I'm going to lean Wander and let you guys take Pete just for fun. But Wander is interesting because he's one of the few guys in baseball this year that we can look at and say that guy's probably going to have a 300 batting average. The BAT X right now projects him at 299, which is, right a hair below, but basically there, with 20 home runs and 10 steals. And he's one of actually only 3 players in the entire league. The Bad X does project for at least 299, 20, and 10. And the other 2 are Soto and Trey Turner. And of course, those guys are going to have way more than all of those categories than 20 and 10, especially the 20 and the 10. But you're kind of looking at a guy who has basically the same skill set and a similar floor as someone I'd say like a Tim Anderson, where you're seeing someone who is not a free swinger, but someone who's selectively aggressive is a term I like to use for them, and who's going to be atop a lineup that's very strong for most of the year. And it's really, and with Wander, you get something of a ceiling where he's such a phenomenal athlete and such a phenomenal regarded prospect that there is always the chance of a click. Of course, we just saw Vladimir Guerrero take 2 years for the click, so we're not really have any idea when the click is going to happen, but there's going to be a click at some point in the next 3 years of Wander Franco. And you could be looking at like 26, 14, 320 with 110 runs and 90 RBIs. And suddenly you're looking at a guy who's probably, again, at the pick range 35 to 40 rather than where he's being picked right now between 55 and 60. So, again, for the sake of argument, I think these guys are pretty split down the middle. And I'll let you guys take Pete, but I think that there's a lot of value to where Wander Franco's going right now.
Yeah, there's definitely that peak that you mentioned with Franco. Like, when is it going to click? And for me, it's mainly about the power. He was 14 homers combined between the 2 levels last year. He had like 7 and 300 plate appearances in the majors. The Bad X has him getting a bit more power to getting up to 20. Eventually, he should be hitting 25 per year, but he's young and he's small. Like, he's 5'11", 189. Generally, with these types of players, the power is the last thing to come around. Like, I know he's a top prospect, and he could absolutely, his ceiling is competing for a batting title next year. He could, I think his ceiling, look at the stat line of like a 2019 DJ LeMahieu, 26 homers, batting title, 200 runs and RBIs, a handful of steals. You could even get more steals than LeMahieu. That's a plausible ceiling for Franco. But does the power come around this year? That's my big question. Is that power ready to come out now? And I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off that, say you don't include Trey Turner or Marcus Semien, who you probably put in your second base slot on your roster. He's the 7th shortstop off the board. And it's so kind of top heavy right now that even behind him, you can go out and get Corey Seager, Jorge Polanco, Carlos Correa. And I'm definitely more comfortable missing out on Wander and taking one of those guys than, or actually even before I go on, like Willy Adames, after pick 100. So I think there are solutions if you miss out on Wander. If you choose him over Pete, maybe there's a first baseman you do like a CJ Cron, Joey Votto, Alex Kirilloff a little later. I just feel like there are less of those options that I'm really comfortable with. And that's a big part of the reason for me. And I think if you're taking Wander, around pick 50, a little after pick 50, you're convinced that 85th percentile sprint speed is going to translate into, a lot more steals than we've seen from him. He was only, he only stole 2 bags over 70 games in the majors last year. And when he was in the minors, I think he was a little above 50%, 56% stolen base rate. So I'm not so sure that the stolen bases will necessarily be there to kind of warrant where he's going. He'll definitely be a huge asset for you in terms of batting average. Agree with Eric that I'm not sure if this is the year where we see the big spike in power. So for that reason, it feels like, Pete, while maybe like a boring pick, is this kind of the safer option. And, I'll never turn down 35 plus home runs for a guy who's shown an improved strikeout rate.
Yeah, definitely. With Pete, I'm just going to play devil's advocate for myself here because I do love the value in Pete. And I think that we've heard a lot of rhetoric this draft season about the strength of like the middle tier first baseman. You mentioned CJ Cron, Jared Walsh, Joey Votto. And those guys are all good. But I think that the league has been a little bit slow, or the community's been a little bit slow to catch up to Pete Alonso and just how dominant he was as a player last year. The only thing that really held him back was how bad the Mets lineup was. That kind of held him below something that could have been like 220, 230 combined runs and RBIs, because He hit over 260, which was right about league average. He struck out less than 20% of the time, which was well below league average. He still had 37 home runs, hitting in a bad lineup, missing 2 weeks with injury, and hitting in Citi Field, which is one of the most disadvantageous parks for hitters in all of baseball. 118 miles an hour max exit velocity, 99th percentile. 10.2% barrels per plate appearance. That was 12th in the entire league. Like, I think really he's just secretly one of the best hitters in baseball. And if this Mets lineup improves the way it might with Starling Marte, Mark Hanna, Brandon Nimmo, and a rebound from Francisco Lindor, all at the top of that order surrounding Pete, but Pete probably hitting either third or fourth, a couple of those guys behind him, a couple of those guys ahead of him. You're looking at a guy who's going to go from 175 runs plus RBIs to, like I said, probably 220. And that's something that could be almost even just the 50th percentile of outcomes. I don't even know what the 80th or 90th percentile of outcomes is for Pete Alonso at this point.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, he did play for a couple weeks after getting that hit by pitch on the hand, and that really sapped his power for maybe 2 weeks. And then he went on the IL. Like you really kind of started to see what he is in that second half. 147 WRC plus with a 285 ISO, and he's just tearing the cover off the ball the entire second half. And it might have went a little under the radar with just like the overall seasons for Matt Olson and Paul Goldschmidt at the position. I think it did go, it was a very quiet, 35 homer season for a guy, which is cool on draft day if you can get him.
And that injury with Pete is even funnier because he played through it in Tampa Bay because he's from North Florida and he had a lot of family and friends who was going to be at that series when the Rays played the Mets, and he just played horribly and then tanked it for another week afterwards before he even wanted to go in the IL, which is just a little funny side story about Pete the guy rather than Pete the player. He's going to go out there every day.
Yeah. I mean, just continuing to add interesting stats onto that second half. He had 275 in the second half. We mentioned the ISO, we mentioned the power, but the contact was starting to come around too. The strikeout rate continued to fall. If he's striking out, if he maintains that strikeout rate and is able to hit 270, 275, there's even profit where he's going.
Tons of profit. He's a guy who could look at going around like the third round next year, similar to like power hitters without any like steal possibilities, like probably below Jordan, but probably where I think a lot of people expect Eloy to be going next year, or where even Eloy was going last year. Like that's the ceiling with Pete Alonso. I think that has been understated. But again, like it depends on your build. If you really want to get batting average, Wander Franco is a guy who could hit, one of the few guys in the league who could hit 300. He's projected to be top 10 an average on basically every projection system that's out there. And if you're in love with CJ Cron or Joey Votto or Jared Walsh, then yeah, it does make a little bit more sense to wait on a corner. But I think I like this one. I think these are two very compelling players here.
Yeah. Is there any shortstops? Like if you don't get Wander, is there any shortstops going after him that you particularly like? I see Jorge Polanco there, and he's not going to give you the average because he's just got a lot of pulled fly balls, but like, is there any that kind of stand out to you if you don't get him, who you kind of want to target?
I think Seager is giving you great batting average with more power than Wander, albeit no steals, but we still don't really know how many steals Wander is going to get on a Texas offense that's going to be improved, especially with the Giants hitting coordinator Donnie Ecker, now the Texas bench coach and director of hitting in the whole organization. So I think that's really meaningful for anyone looking at drafting Rangers. I also like sneakily Ahmed Rosario, who's going to give you really high average. He puts the ball in play a lot. He hits it harder than people think. He's probably going to give you a similar amount of steals to Franco, as a guy who's really fast, but has always just chosen not to run for whatever reason. We don't know. And the Guardians lineup, I also think is a little bit sneaky better than people think right now. And Rosario is going after pick 150 in most leagues.
Cool. You guys ready to move on? Any final thoughts before we jump to the third debate?
No, I'm good. That was a good one. I like that.
Cool. So our third debate is, I think it's an interesting one. We have outfielder Jared Kelenic at around pick 133 and Zach Gallen of the Diamondbacks at pick 140. Both guys didn't live up to their lofty expectations last season. Gallen was expected to take that next step as a, potential fantasy ace, being drafted last year as an SP2, an early SP2, battled injury all season long, hairline fracture in his arm, small tear to his UCL, and then a hamstring strain. When he was on the mound, was, relatively ineffective, never had a feel for his repertoire, really had to rely on that fastball. Then you have Kelenic, probably more preseason buzz than anyone last year. people were probably thinking of him last year as a top 20, top 25 outfielder when he did come up. Really struggled in that first stint, including an 0 for 39 slump. So both of these guys going around the 11th round in a 12-teamer. I'll start with you, James. Who do you prefer this year in drafts and why?
Again, this is something that's really going to depend on your build and whether you're looking, because these are two guys who are going to be an upside pick. It's like a breakout versus a bounce back, or even Kelenic is like a minor bounce back because he's supposed to be so much better than he was. And it's even shocking to think that last year Kelenic was going like in the 7th to 8th rounds of a lot of mixed leagues, which was just crazy to see. But I probably will just lean Gallen a little bit. I do think that there's a better chance that he gives you the floor of a guy, because you're still taking him in like generally the top half of most drafts here than from Kelenic. But it's really razor thin. It kind of just depends on where your gut is telling you is going to be the one who really makes it back better. But Eric?
Yeah, these are exactly the types of picks that you want to be making in the middle rounds. These are both guys with really high upside. You can't go wrong taking them in back-to-back rounds, honestly. I'm leaning Gallen as well, just because I think Kelenic is going to continue to have some average problems as he continues to smooth things out. I'm not ready to project his last 100 plate appearances over a full 600 plate appearance schedule. We've seen a little bit more from Gallen at the major league level. And also a starting pitcher hit this late is just a little bit more valuable than a batter hitting this late.
Unless he steals 25 bags.
Unless he steals 25 bags, sure.
Yeah, but Anthony, where are you feeling here?
Yeah, and this might be a little bit of bias in that I've seen him do it at the major league level already, but I'm going Gallen. And just because I think in some sense, because I've seen it before at the majors, it's more reassuring that he'll rediscover that level quickly. One thing that I think in some sense I forgot about because Kelenic's first stint in the majors was so bad was just how good he was down the stretch in September. Hit 7 of his 14 home runs. It's still tough to really bank on, where his plate discipline is right now. I think that's the concerning part in that he's probably, not going to provide the average that you might have thought when he was coming in last year. And it's still a little bit of a work in progress. I would say that the reasons I'm a little more comfortable with Gallen is that, even last year, all 3 of his secondaries experienced a drop in their CSW rate. He couldn't get whiffs with those secondaries, and he had to just, rely on his fastball over 54% of the time. And despite that, there's like this silver lining in that hitters knew they were, getting a fastball, but he still had a 25% called strike rate, which is pretty elite. He still had that elite, K per 9 over 10.3. And there just were like little glimmers of promise here and there. And I think really he just needs that offseason reset button. And he can get a fresh start. Another kind of reason for promise for me is that, the Diamondbacks now have a new pitching coach in Brent Strom. I think he has that pedigree to help Gallen, rediscover that full repertoire. You see success stories under him like Dallas Keuchel, Charlie Morton, a lot of other Houston pitchers, and you kind of get that belief, that sense that he's in good hands. So I guess to follow up on that, the bat, ATC, steamer, all project Gallen to have an ERA over 4. His season's derailed a bit by stops and starts. I guess now he's got a new pitching coach. How confident are you guys in him getting back to where we previously saw him?
I think previously saw him might be lofty because what was he like before the injury last year? He was going in like the 3rd round of standard mixed leagues. Like that's something that I think we're probably still a year away from. But even as much as he struggled last year, and he did say, like, not even verbatim, like he said it exactly, that the hairline fracture affected the way he was able to throw breaking balls and gave him discomfort in throwing them. And all 3 of his primary breaking balls between his slider, his curveball, and his changeup had a whiff rate over 30%. As bad as they performed in terms of contact, they were still able to miss bats like at a level that you would want a guy like Gallen who doesn't have the elite fastball to do. And he did also introduce a new cutter into his repertoire last year, which comes in harder than his slider. Slider comes in about 85 and falls on a plane right in between the curveball in that cutter, but the cutter comes in at 90 and it still has significant bite, above league average in terms of horizontal movement. I still see a guy with 5 pitches who's going to have one of the most talented pitching coaches in all of baseball on a team that is not going to be anywhere nearly as bad as they were last year. Like, he missed that first month last year, and the season was already over for the Diamondbacks. The team was in complete disarray. It was an utter catastrophe. They lost, 20 games in a row through May? Like, they weren't even, I don't know, the series in the summer, I felt like Diamondbacks, half of them, like, weren't even, like, aware of what was going on at times. And you're going to have great infield defense still with, not great infield defense, but good infield defense with that team, between Nick Ahmed possibly having a full-time role again. Wherever Josh Rojas plays, his glove is usually relatively steady. Ketel Marte, if he's on the infield, is going to be a steady fielder. And I see a guy that's going to be at least fine, who's going to strike guys out, pitching in a ballpark that's usually a little bit forgiving to pitchers, especially fly ball pitchers, with just a lot of things to be able to throw at opposing hitters.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony, you mentioned the inability to get whiffs last year. It's something that we hadn't really seen. He had 150 innings between 2019 and 2020, and that swinging strike rate and it was around 12%. And then last year it dropped to 9. And you have to ask yourself, did he forget how to pitch? Did something happen? But the easy story out there is the story that he's presented himself, and the story that is probably the one that makes the most sense is that he was hurt. I'm going to take that low-hanging fruit and buy that, yeah, he was hurt and that he's now healthy, and we can expect him to get back to that same skill level that he was. Now, can we expect a sub-3 ERA like he was doing in 2019, 2020? Probably not. It's still, they're not going to be a 52-win team, but they're also probably not going to be an 80-win team. They're 65, 70 wins, probably something like that. It's still going to be a little tough for him to reach his peak value in terms of fantasy. But I don't buy that he just lost 3% swinging strike rate without some other story going on there. And I think the injury makes sense.
Especially with all of those breaking balls individually still getting better than 30% whiffs. I think that's meaningful when you look at what Gallen could be, because it's always going to be the depth of his breaking pitches.
Yeah, so it seems like we're all, on the Gallen side. I think the thing that makes this debate a little bit closer between the two is just the lack of depth in the outfield this year. I do think there's some quite a few, good starting pitching options in the middle rounds. So Kelenich's 36 outfielder off the board. Probably at least 5 of those guys that I looked at are probably going to end up in your infield slot because they're multi-eligible. Do you see any scenario where you'd, maybe in a 5 outfielder league that you feel the need to be aggressive and, draft Kelenic for the sake of what's kind of behind him in the outfield, on your draft day?
I think I would, just especially because that Kelenic still has the ceiling. As bad as he was last year, and he was brutal. He's 73 WRC plus, 180 batting average, and 270 WOBA for the whole season. He still found his way into 14 home runs and 6 stolen bases in just 90 games. And 12 of those home runs and 4 of those stolen bases came after the second call-up. And Eric or Anthony, one of you mentioned before that 7 of those home runs just came in September alone. So you look at a guy who probably has a floor that sits around 20 and 10, which is something that's getting Trent Grisham drafted in basically the exact same range. His ADP is about 10 spots behind Kelenic. And both of these guys are going to struggle in batting average. Grisham probably is a little bit higher, 240, 250, while Kelenic still has the propensity to give you a 215 over the full season, which would just tank that category. But you still have that inkling of hope that if you have always believed that Jared Kelenic was, and will be an elite talent, this should be a buy for you every single step of the way. You kind of almost have to trust your initial feeling, your initial the initial opinion that you've made on Jared Kelenic, and try and, as some people on Twitter say, buy the dip here and do that. And just as an example that means literally nothing, Mike Trout had an 87 WRC plus in his first season in baseball, then had 10 more seasons next year. And I'm expecting Kelenic to be somewhere in between 0 wins and 10 wins this year for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we got spoiled a little bit with prospects coming up, notable prospects coming up and just immediately hitting the ground running. So then when one does struggle with a big name, he kind of gets forgotten about quickly. And it's interesting. I think even if you miss out on Kelenic, you can look at a guy like Joe Adele, who's available after pick 230. Andrew Vaughn is also available around pick 230. These are names that, maybe not at the level of Kelenic we had excitement for before they hit the majors. And they're still young. They still have a lot of upside. So it's interesting to see where Kelnick is going in relation to them.
Yeah, so we mentioned this with I mentioned at the top. You can't go wrong picking either of these two guys in the mid rounds. They're both super high upside. They're both good picks at this ADP. I think. We also mentioned with Franco how there's a range of outcomes possible, and that top outcome, that top 15% outcome for Kelenic is also super interesting, just like it is with Franco. So now you're not having to pay as much of a premium for it. So I think they're both good picks. Are there guys later on in the outfield that I would go after? Yeah, I really like Kirilloff this year, and that's another guy who had, top prospect. He had that wrist injury, but he was hitting it was like a 600 expected slugging before he had that wrist injury going the opposite way. He was showing me a lot of good skills. Akil Badu's a good hitter. Another interesting one going in the 220s. Harrison Bader had like a 163 WRC plus in September, October, had a 150 in July. We forget that we don't like to mention that it was 22 in August in between those, but I'm a little intrigued, especially at his price. So yeah, there are a few guys later, but Kelenic is definitely better. I'd probably pick Kelenic a little bit over Kirilloff, but I'm a big Kirilloff lover this year.
Yeah, I do like Kirilloff this year, but the Kelenic, you always just have that tantalizing bit of upside that you're not going to be able to get elsewhere in drafts. Like even if you look at Kelenic's 90th percentile of outcomes, you look at like 30 and 20 with like a 250 average. That could win you a league. Or if he goes 15 and 8 with 220, that could lose you the league. So it's kind of a fun spot where you can make that call and then see. Well, it can't lose you a league. One pick will never lose you the league. You have a whole season worth of moves here, but it's just fun to be able to make these little picks during the draft and be able to kind of fantasize about them in January.
Yeah,
especially
go on, Eric.
Especially an 11th round pick. That's all I wanted to say. Not going to lose you the league.
Yeah, I would say if you're worried about that with Kelenic, you can spend a pick. Like you can prioritize a pick, a little after 200 and get like a guy who's perceived as more of like older and boring. Like you can draft AJ Pollock or you can draft Charlie Blackmon.
Lourdes Gurriel.
Yeah, and you can get these guys later on, and if you kind of get the worst case scenario with Kelenic, where he comes out and struggles again, you have a, at least a, solid. You kind of guys that you kind of know what you're getting, even if it's no longer, kind of upper echelon production. It'll at least hold you over until you find that next breakthrough guy on the wire.
And I think a big thing to identify with this player debate is who this year could be the Kelenic and the Gallen from last year, the guys who you're getting at a discount the following year because of some lack of production. I look at someone like Bobby Witt, who I've seen go as high as the 6th or 7th rounds in some drafts, being someone who has major swing and miss potential with a role that is less than determined, who could really, it's a really massive risk. And I think people are only buying the upside right now and not even leaving that much room for profit. And even just in spring training, pay attention to pitching injuries. If a guy's dealing with a nagging injury and he's on a bad team, that's usually not a recipe for success. I know it feels like there's going to be a lot of upside there because you're getting a guy at a discount, like getting this guy around later than he was going a month ago, but it could just wind up being a complete wasted investment. So just take in all the news and be able to make new opinions and form new ideas when new information is presented.
All right, so we just got finished mentioning pairing the young with old, and that kind of leads us into our final pairing here. Are we ready to move on?
Mm-hmm.
So, young versus old. Solid innings production versus a little bit of a volume concern. Around 200 overall, we've got, depending on how your team is looking, your answer might be really, really different to this debate. We've got Tanner Houck over on one side representing the youth, and Adam Wainwright on the other representing the not so young, the experienced. So Anthony, let's hear from you first. Who you got here, Houck or Wainwright?
Yeah, I think I went into this one thinking I was going to take Wainwright just because of the consistency provided. But I actually think I go Houck here. I don't know if I just kind of didn't do my homework on Houck enough before, but I was, pleasantly surprised to look at a lot of what he had done last year. I walked in really with concerns about his role and his, opportunity to pitch deep into games. And I think, though, like when I stepped back and you're thinking about how you want to build your roster through the draft, those aren't quite things that I'm going to be as concerned about this late in the draft. Best case scenario, he gets the role and he's allowed to kind of, pitch deeper into games than he has been in the past. And, it's a very, high value pick, a high return on investment pick, most likely for you. If not, if he doesn't have that role and you're in a shallow league, you can probably just find that pitcher who we kind of didn't see coming early on in the season, find him on the waiver wire, where Wainwright, we kind of know what he's going to give you. And he's got a lot of good opportunities against some poor offenses in the NL Central. But the upside and, the flexibility with your roster that a guy like Howe can provide, whether it's the best case or the worst case scenario, has me leaning towards him.
Yeah, I honestly, similar to you, I've gone back and forth on this a few times. I came into it thinking I wanted Wainwright. I wanted 180 innings. As innings become more scarce, wins, people always forget that wins are a major stat, especially in 5x5 leagues. It's 20% of your pitching production, and he's someone who you're going to be able to bank on for wins because he pitches deep into games. He has a good bullpen, has a good home park, and has a team that's probably going to be better than a lot of the teams they face, especially in their own division. But the more I look at Houck, the more I think that we're sitting on a guy who we should be considering as we talk about guys like Shane Baz, who goes about 30, 40 picks ahead of him. Because you kind of have to think about the Red Sox now as the Rays, not so much in terms of development, but a lot in terms of workload. And I think Houck pitched more innings last year than a lot of people kind of remember, because he was doing the 3-4 inning thing for a while through the summer. And then suddenly, as the race heated up for the Red Sox in the AL East, they kind of started to take the training wheels off a little bit. And then once the playoffs came, he was probably their most trusted starting pitcher, especially in the ALCS against Houston. Between every level last year, AAA, the regular season, and the postseason, Houck crossed the 100-inning threshold. He actually threw 100 and 1/3 innings. So I think that he's going to see a jump this year to put him about 120 to 140 in the regular season, which the effectiveness I'm expecting him to reach, that kind of, for me, vaults him past Wainwright at their cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ATC only has Houck at like 110 innings, and I saw that projection and I said, that seems weird. He was already at 100 last year, and the last three starters, as they currently have it in roster resource for the Red Sox, Nick Pivetta, Rich Hill, and Michael Wacha. What are the chances that all three of them make it through the year? I mean, come on. Tanner Houck is gonna be a starter there. He's gotta be if they want to compete, right?
He's at least going to have a role that allows him to throw enough innings to pitch more than most of those guys. I see all three of those pitchers you mentioned. Maybe not Pivetta. Pivetta was a bit of a horse last year, but Wacha and Hill are going to do the same thing they did with the Rays last year, which is wind up with a ERA between 4 and 5 and between 90 and 115 innings. And they're going to need someone to fill in that gap, especially because a guy like Chris Sale threw 60 innings total last year. How many can you really expect out of him coming off a 2-year layoff from Tommy John surgery? 100, maybe? There's an outside shot that Tanner Houck throws the second most innings on this team besides Pivetta, notwithstanding whoever they bring in after the lockout hopefully ends soon. But I think that, I don't know, I just really see Houck as a guy who has the upside of a guy. I'm going to mention again, Shane Baz, who's going off much later. And if you can get your innings, your guaranteed innings a little bit earlier, you take this shot now instead, and then you can really reap the benefits.
Yeah, you mentioned Shane Baz twice, and he actually came to mind for me as well when thinking about what would be the situation where I would draft Wainwright over Houck. The first one is that if I'm in a deep league and I know I need innings. The second one is if I take Shane Baz and there are those concerns that maybe he doesn't start the season up with the Rays, I'm gonna need to make up those innings somehow. So if I can get a guy who's a guaranteed workhorse to kind of supplement picking Baz earlier in the draft, you can kind of pair those two together, where it's I think gives you a little more kind of reliability in terms of innings if you've got Baz on your roster.
Definitely. And I think in the similar range as Baz, I see a guy like Framber Valdez go. And Framber Valdez is not going to press anybody with stuff, but very similarly to Wainwright, he's going to pitch a lot of innings on a good team with good defense. And he's always going to be put, more so than Wainwright, in positions to succeed because of how smart his organization is. So if you could stack Valdez with Houck, you're looking at 350 innings of 10, 11 Ks per 9, and you're probably looking at 38 wins between the pair. That's something that I like it when you get to the back of these drafts to put two guys together and look at the production you're getting from two and have that even you out to what it would be for one, and kind of see where you can win your categories here and win them there, where your draft room is giving.
Yeah, I also thought a lot about the situations that would lead me to draft Wainwright, because I don't dislike him. There's actually some reasons to think that he's still undervalued around 200 overall. So like if I've gone earlier in the draft, if I've gone like a Michael Kopech and a Luis Severino, another couple of guys with volume concerns, I'd be pretty good going with Wainwright. The projection systems don't like him, but projection systems aren't taking into account the defense. 5 Gold Glovers plus Yadi Molina behind the plate and getting to pitch in the NL Central in Busch Stadium. It's a great situation. That's why Steven. That's why Matz as well is like kind of an okay guy to have at the end of your draft. And then Wainwright's also being hit in the projections with the age-related degeneration. And for a guy who pitches the way he does, we can really wonder whether it should be as big as it normally is, or whether it should be there at all. There are reasons to believe that Wainwright, maybe he's not going to be like a 3.06 ERA again, but he could be mid threes, and that's pretty good. That works.
Yeah, I think kind of the big takeaway, from this one was that you do need some form of a blend between upside and volume. And you do have to kind of, when you get to the end of your draft, look at your roster and see, where you're a little short on which side of the equation to balance them out. So I was just like looking after pick 200 and was like, who are the guys that give you a little bit of both if you're not kind of going one end or the other. And you see Patrick Sandoval, Tristan McKenzie, Josiah Gray, all available after pick 200. So if you kind of want to find a blend of those two, upside with, kind of guaranteed role in the rotation, or a likely guaranteed role in the rotation, those were a few guys that jumped out to mind for me.
I think Wasker Yanoa is another one that hasn't been very talked about this draft season, who does give you that blend of like reliability and situation plus upside. But then I think about everyone you just mentioned, Eric, between Severino, Kopech, and Boz. And I can't really see how Tanner Houck is significantly worse than all of them, or project significantly worse at that. Like he finagled a lot last year between his four-seam fastball and his sinker, and he had starts where he was featuring each of them, seemingly like unsure of which was going to be the pitch. And the sinker is really unbelievable. It breaks like I think 30% more than average in baseball in terms of drop. And you see the inklings of a guy who could, similar to what Logan Webb did last year in the snap of a finger, be someone who misses tons of bats with a slider and is impervious against hard contact with a dominant sinker. And that potential is so great. And I think his workload is even more secure than Kopech, Severino, or Boz.
Yeah, it's hard to find a guy that late who has a 30% strikeout rate and a pitch in the slider that's got 36% CSW. So it seems like there's a lot of value to be had there.
Absolutely. So like as we get to the end of this discussion, did you learn anything about how the draft is unfolding or what markets are saying to you in this? We're still early on in this draft season. It's still, if we're looking at NFBC data, it's still really heavily weighted by these draft and hold leagues, just a few fab leagues out there. But have you learned anything in terms of general insights that you're going to put into your drafts?
Definitely, to bring this back to our first debate, the saves they're going so early in leagues. Like I was looking at a mock the other day, not a mock. I think I was just like perusing the NFC website, seeing when you can see the draft rooms at finish. I saw Class A go in the 4th or the 5th round. Like it is really, we're in a situation where if you want to get saved, especially in a league where fab is not as easy to go about, you have to jump and get them. Like I don't even think that by the time March rolls around, if you are participating in these drafts and holds on the NFBC, you can even wait to the end of the 2nd round to take Hader and Hendricks. Like they're both going to go before then, and probably before the end of the 4th for Diaz, Presley, Iglesias, and Clase. So that's the one thing I've learned. Then the way that market gets set, as you guys mentioned before, like the other people are going to jump in after. Every single closer is getting pushed up based on where that first one goes.
Yeah, and for me, I think like looking back to last year, I wasn't very confident in like the mid to late round starting pitching. That there's guys that are going to emerge or break out, but I wasn't confident that I could pick them out. But this year it looks like there's a lot of really decent pitching options in the mid rounds. And even as you get a little later, So it really makes me want to prioritize the hitting side, more early on and more frequent than I did last year. And then, the other thing I think was just every year you kind of look about like what are the positions that you kind of need to have a plan going in on. And you see like, shortstop again this year, like there are just a lot of guys that I'd be A-okay drafting. And, it all kind of depends on, who will kind of come at the right price and where you're kind of drafting, if it's a snake draft. So, that's not the case at every position. Obviously third base is, fairly weak looking this year. So just knowing which of the positions I want to go in, knowing like, I don't want to drop below like this guy, on draft day.
Absolutely, yeah. So, James, you mentioned closers. It's a good plug for me. I'm going to be with Greg Jewett and George Montanez talking specifically how to draft closers here in 2022. That's going to be Saturday at 6. We'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about. The market for closers and for saves in general, is crazy this year. Lots of changes. So, if you're not sure how to draft closers, tune into that. If you're not, also, I've got just released a couple of articles about relieving sleepers and busts. Maybe those can provide some insights. James, where can we read and hear more from you?
You can find me on Twitter at GTherehadNoRange. If anyone out there is a Mets fan, I have the Mets Up podcast with Draftnik Mark Luinos, presenting on Saturday with Pitching Ninja about content creation. I'm going to be a part of the fantasy team this year for Pitcher List. I'm going to be writing articles. I have starting pitcher busts coming out next week. And everyone out there, just make sure you use all of these incredible PL resources that will be available to you this season, because there's going to be a lot of great content, a lot of great fantasy content, a lot of great baseball information in general. So everyone, please be ready for that and take advantage of it.
Excellent. And Anthony, if people want to hear more from you, read more from you, where can they go?
Yeah, over on Twitter at Anthony Tucker 81. Like I said, on the fantasy team for Pitcher List, doing the two start pitcher articles during the regular season. I do have an article coming out within the next couple days on a few starting pitcher injury bounce backs that you might want to target in drafts. So definitely be on the lookout for that if you're interested.
Excellent. And with me, I already plugged myself. So, and if you, as the listener, if you enjoyed this discussion, if you want to have more discussions like this, come join us in the PL Discord. It comes with the PL Plus as one of the benefits. You can have conversations like this all the time. There are forums where you can talk about relievers, starting pitchers, anything that you want. It's a great resource. So yeah, James, I saw you wanted to add something there.
I would say literally 24 hours a day. There are people in all of those channels talking about every single player in baseball you could even imagine. It's a fantastic time.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us. I hope you learned a little bit about how we're approaching drafts, a little bit about ADP. So I'll go ahead and wait for Nick. It's 4:00 here.
Hey, what's going on?
Right on time.
That was awesome, guys. Thank you so much for talking about all this stuff. Really good discussion and everything. But yeah, you can find all these people on PL Plus. You all should be getting PL Plus, and it's going to be even better when we launch PL 7. We're going to showcase a few of those things on Saturday during the reveal trailer. So definitely get that to help out. But really, Eric, Anthony, James, great to see you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thanks
for having us.
All right, see you Saturday.